Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on modernizing records management with Microsoft 365. My name is Vlad Catrinescu, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Before we get started with the amazing content we have planned for today, let me cover some of the housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and will be sent to everybody who registered within 48 hours after the webinar. And we encourage you to send this recording to any friend or colleague who you think might benefit from the knowledge in this webinar. And the slides will also be shared with you. We would also like to encourage you to take this opportunity to ask any questions you might have about records management in Microsoft 365. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask all of the questions you might have, and we'll make sure to get to all of them during the call. Now enough of the boring housekeeping, and let's get to the fun stuff. And first of all, I'd like to introduce you to my good friend and co-host for this webinar, Drew Madelung. How are you doing, Drew?
Great, Vlad. Good to be back. It's been only a few weeks since our last one, so excited to talk more today about records management.
Awesome. And today we don't only have one, but we actually have two special guests directly from Microsoft. First of all, Roberto Yglesias. How are you doing, Roberto?
Doing great, Vlad. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Hey, thank you for being here. I know you've presented at quite a few conferences before, but for people that never have seen you or heard about you before, can you do a quick introduction?
Totally. Yeah. So I'm Roberto Yglesias. I'm a principal PM manager with Microsoft 365 compliance team. What that means is essentially me and my team are responsible for building the product, and we're the product managers for the information governance and records management features of Microsoft 365. Like you said, I come from the community. I was a consultant for many years before joining Microsoft, and have been at this for about a year now inside the mothership.
Awesome, you joined the mothership. You see that people that have only been here for 1 or 2 years still call it the mothership. After that, it kind of becomes home. Next thing you know, you've been there for 15 years. And you got, who do we had recently, Drew? I think we had Mike McLean that had just received a nice trophy for 15 years.
Yeah, and I think we were talking with Scott too, who was I think like 17 years. I mean, yeah, we've talked to a lot of people that have been there for a very long time. It's that's very cool to see.
Awesome. And our second special guest for today's webinar is Tina Ying. How are you doing, Tina?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me here.
Hey, thank you for participating in this community webinar. Can you please introduce yourself for people that never have seen you before?
Yes, for sure. So my name is Tina Ying. I'm the product marketing manager working on M365 compliance team. So working very closely with Roberto on the records management and information governance solution.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking records management. I know, Drew, that's something that everything compliance and records management, you've always been my go-to person for a lot of it. So I know that's something that Drew wanted to schedule for a long time before.
I did, yeah. And I think, so just for some context around this and why I think it's really important. So for people that have not listened to these before, I am an Office 365 consultant, similar to probably what Roberto had done in the past. And I work with, we're working very recently for frequently for the past few years with highly regulated industries, a lot in the financial space, in the power and the utility space, and a little bit in healthcare. So I've gotten to see a lot of the requirements, the nuances of some very large scale implementations as it relates to security and compliance. So one of the things that I felt had been unheralded has been around records management. And my roots do come from SharePoint. So a lot of I've done multiple projects in or especially on the planning side, of transitioning away from SharePoint on-premises records management solutions, which at the time were fantastic, right? It was one way to manage records, and it worked great. It did what it needed to do. And in moving to Microsoft 365 and helping customers move into a modern experience, we run into both challenges and opportunities to take advantage of the new platform. And what I want to make sure people really take away from this is, if you haven't thought about records management inside of your deployment yet, I hope you're listening to this, because you need to talk about it. You need to understand what the capabilities are out there today, because the philosophy is moving away from just records managers or people filing stuff into a cabinet, and only certain people know how records work. It's moving into a fashion of what your daily work is and how you work changes when you move to the cloud, which also means that the way records work will change when you move to the cloud. So I'm very excited to have Roberto and Tina here to kind of help guide us through some of the experiences and what we see on the Microsoft side, and really talk about what are some of the opportunities to take advantage of it. So with that, Roberto, Tina, you guys have been doing this for a little bit longer. What are some, as I kind of transfer over to you, Roberto, what are some of the things that you kind of want to talk about in kicking this off, or some of the things you've seen in moving into Microsoft recently that make records management important?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a lot, and we'll talk through that in terms of how customers are leveraging Microsoft 365 to really modernize their records management. And think we'll get started first a little bit with some of the context of kind of how we're thinking about the problem, and how we're thinking about the compliance space, the governance and record space, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into kind of records management, our view of it, and what we have out there. We'll do a little bit of a short demo, and then hope to leave a lot of room for our Q&A and discussion at the end as well. So I'll actually ask Tina to kind of start and walk us through a little bit of how we're looking at the compliance space and governance and records management.
Yeah, thank you, Roberto. So as Drew mentioned, that there are a lot of data now, especially during this remote work environment. It's really hard for you to draw a perimeter around your data landscape. So it's everywhere. It's in your endpoint, it's your email, your messaging tools. So it's hard to say like, oh, I just want to manage the records in one place. It's everywhere. It could be everywhere, wherever you work. On top of that, we are seeing that there's more and more data regulation out there. So there's GDPR, there's CCPA. In Brazil, in Thailand, they all have their own data protection regulation. So it makes it even more complicated. And some of the statistics also show that there are more than 80% of a company data is dark, which is unstructured. It's harder to classify. You need tools to help you with that. And because of that, protecting and governing sensitive information become one of the biggest concerns when it comes to data protection and compliance with regulation. And also we are seeing that a lot of people are having this awareness of their personal data, their personal privacy rights. So the archiving personal data and how you keep those data become a critical risk as well. So when we are thinking about managing the records, we also need to consider all this complexity in the data protection world. And within Microsoft, we have a set of solutions, the compliance and risk management solution to help you with that. So on the slide, you can see there's 4 solution areas here. We start with information protection and governance, using machine learning and AI to help you to discover, classify, and enforce protection and governance policy on top of that data. So it's building in Microsoft 365 where your user work. The second solution area is the insider risk management. So we help you to collect and correlate the data signal from different tools to help you to identify those critical insider risk. The third one is discover and respond. So this also is very relevant to the records management area. Whenever you keep something as a record, sometimes you need to be able to discover them in a timely manner. And then so our e-discovery tool can help you to do that. We use machine learning and AI to quickly identify the most relevant data to help you with any litigation or data subject requests, etc. And at the bottom of our solution area is the compliance management, really help you to provide that integrated experience across the 3 solution areas above. So we provide you with an easy to understand score to measure your compliance maturity and give you recommended guidance of what are some of the actions you can take to comply with a certain regulatory requirement. So really help you to simplify this compliance complexity here. And today, we are going to focus on the information protection and governance area. So when we talk about information protection and governance, we start with understanding your data. And once you understand that, you can protect that, you can govern that. So on the right-hand side, you can see we have a unified approach to do so. You start by discover your sensitive or business critical information. You classify them using our machine learning, sensitive information type, trainable classifier, which Roberto will show you later in the demo. And then you can apply protection policy and governance policy. So under protection, you will be able to do DLP, encryption. Under governance, you will be able to set up retention policy, deletion policy, and do records management there. It's all building in Microsoft 365. So your user can still collaborate while you have those policy on top of your information. And then lastly, we help you to monitor this policy. So you can know whether the data is classified accurately, whether you need to fine tune the policy based on what you see in the tenant environment. So we give you all those insights as well that Roberto will show you in the demo. And when we talk about the governance area, I want to double click on that. So we want to help you with 2 things. The first one is information governance. We want to help you to only keep what you need and delete what you don't in your data landscape. So that you can reduce your attack surface. You only keep the data you need for your business. So that will help you to reduce the security, operational, and legal risk in the end. The second part we want to help you with is the records management area. For your high value sensitive information, you need specialized process to help you to govern those records. So you can show to your regulator that you keep these records in a defensible and immutable way. So within M365, we also develop those capabilities to help you to meet the regulatory obligation. So I'm going to pass the floor to Roberto to show you the exciting area, records management.
Awesome. Thank you, Tina. And thank you for the introduction. And I think this group probably is very familiar with records management and kind of the standards of it. But many times we think about records management just in the context of what we consider business records that need to be preserved for a long time or that are being formally declared. But at the end of the day, records management is all about that, maintaining that evidence of the business activities and transactions. So when we think about records management, there's a lot of things that today happen in an organization that should be preserved to be able to provide that appropriate evidence down the road that we need to make sure that is being appropriately identified and captured. That can be decisions that are being made on chat, on email, or even many different ways that people are communicating today. And so at Microsoft, we look at records management and we see that there are some new challenges that customers are telling us that records management is not new, right? We've been doing it for years. We've been doing it since it was all on paper. Digital records management has been around as long as we've had digital files. But the modern world, especially these new world order and unique circumstances of everybody being remote, all of us leveraging the information in the cloud, present some new challenges, right? I'll start with the kind of the challenge on the right-hand side, because it's one of the ones we hear a lot from our customers, which is there's an overwhelming amount of updates happening to regulations today. As Tina mentioned, it's not just the amount of regulations, but it's also the updates to them. And if you worked in records management for a long time, there used to be times where regulations would not get updated for 10 years. So you didn't have to review your file plan or your retention schedule to make sure it was meeting it appropriately. You just had done that exercise, and as long as the regulations didn't change, you were good. Or if you didn't change your internal procedures and processes. And so the overwhelming amount of updates makes it a lot more challenging for customers to be able to keep up with what's going on and make sure how does those changes affect their retention schedule. And then, as Drew was mentioning, when we move to the cloud, we have a lot more data. The data is everywhere in many different places. Now, what the definition of that record as something that I would take and the records manager would take to, a special archive cabinet no longer exists, right? The records are everywhere. They're in many different file types or formats or, types of data. And so we need to be able to adapt to that. And what we've done in the past for digital records management especially is we've asked end users, those that are the information workers doing their jobs every day with this data, to be the ones that appropriately categorize and move this data or flag this data for records managers. All of that leads to inconsistency and user error because everybody's trying to do their job, and managing the records is just a lot of work on top of that. And having to move them to a different location can often lead to the records just being lost in the way. Right. And so, as Drew was mentioning in the introduction, it is common to see organizations still have a records management system that is separate from their collaboration system. And so that creates a lot of friction for having to move it and a lot of potential for error. So looking at that and these challenges is where we've taken the next step on the evolution of Microsoft 365 records management and released the records management solution within Microsoft 365 to really help you manage those legal, business, and regulatory record keeping obligations. And one of the things you'll see us do is our approach to records management is trying to look at it with a fresh lens and new modern approach. So you will see us at times release features that might challenge your assumption of what a record should be or the traditional interpretation of records and how records should be handled, because we're going to be pushing the limits on should we be reinterpreting some of those kind of old and traditional ways of managing records while still being able to provide the same amount of accountability and auditability that records require. And so as we go through this, you might see some of those features, and you'll definitely see us do that going forward. Now, there are three key aspects of our records management solution that we focus on. And I promise this is the last slide before I jump into a quick demo. Basically, the first one's around being built into Microsoft 365. We believe that for records management to be effective, you have to do it right where you're collaborating in the tools that our information workers are already familiar with. Nobody has time in this day and age to be able to learn a new system or to move the information to other places. So being built in right into the productivity tools that you use every day is key for us. And we'll continue to evolve that and become even better integrated with all of the Microsoft 365 productivity suite. And then we think that relying on just manual actions is never going to scale, especially when we're producing more data than ever before. Every year, we producing an exponential amount of data compared to the year before. So we think that the intelligence aspect that we can bring to records management really will separate how customers will use our solution to be able to accomplish their record keeping obligations, because we will be able to scale through the automated intelligent classification and be able to apply that intelligence to the whole life cycle of records management. We're just getting started on that journey with trainable classifiers, which I'll talk about in a second, but we have many more features that we have planned to really bring all of that intelligence that Microsoft has to Microsoft 365 and records management. And last but not least, the third key pillar that we're working around is the fact of being defensible. We understand that our customers have a wide array of compliance obligations that they need to meet, and that no two regulations are the same. So depending on where you are in the world or what industry you're in, you have particular obligations. And we want to make sure that our solution is able to meet all of those requirements, and you can use it for the most stringent regulations to some of the more relaxed or easier to meet. And so you will see us continuing to invest on that. And from here, I'd like to just jump into a quick demo, and then we'll open it up for a little bit more of questions. That sounds good. All right, let me switch over then, and let's go to our demo. For the demo, we're going to do kind of 3 parts to it really quickly and talk about these are the 3 steps that I typically think about the records management journey. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I used to be a consultant helping organizations implement some of these records management or information governance features with Microsoft 365 and other systems. And so this is kind of how I typically would think about it. First, you got to start by defining your retention schedule, your categories. How are you going to do those processes and procedures? And then you got to classify all that data. Make sure that everything you have today gets classified for the appropriate definition that you created. And then finally, you got to get into that cycle of executing all of that retention, executing the processes of disposition, and making sure that everything you're doing is auditable and you can understand where everything is at. So let's take a look at how Microsoft 365 can help you in each one of those. Getting started with defining, typically the activities we want to do here is identifying our applicable regulations, creating your policies and procedures for the organization, and then creating your retention schedule. Now, for identifying your applicable regulations, many organizations already know what regulations they need to meet, but they don't know how do those translate to a retention schedule. One of the things that we won't demo here today, but I would encourage everybody to check out, is the compliance score, which Tina mentioned earlier, which allows you to map those applicable regulations that you're subject to controls that you can enable in Microsoft 365. So we've had our team of experts already go through those regulations and suggest some of the actions that you should be taking to be able to meet them. Now, once you do that and you define the appropriate schedule and policies and procedures that you think you need to be able to meet the regulations, the next step is to actually go in and create that retention schedule. So let's take a look how you can do that within Microsoft 365. If I switch over to the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, by the way, some of you might still not have seen the Compliance Center. It's been out for a little less than a year. And it is the new location where we will continue to evolve all of our compliance solutions. So if you're still using the legacy security and compliance center, we encourage you to move to this. For everything information governance and records management, actually, pretty soon you will not be able to do any actions in the security and compliance center. And the new Microsoft 365 Compliance Center will be the location for it. So when I land on the Compliance Center, I can go to the catalog here on the left-hand side and see all the different compliance solutions that are available, all of those that Tina was mentioning earlier. Now, I'm going to take a look at the records management one. If I haven't done it already, I could pin it to the navigation. I have already done that. And so for that solution, I can just go ahead and open it. I'll land on an overview that will tell me some of the things that are going on, but where I want to go to create my retention schedule is really the file plan. The file plan manager is your digital version of your retention schedule. And the unit of or the cornerstone of the file plan manager are retention labels. We look at retention labels as a way of categorizing everything for your retention purposes. And typically, for most organizations, we would recommend a mapping of one retention label to a category. Now, if you are one of those organizations that has a pretty big retention schedule with hundreds of different categories you got to retain, then we do recommend you probably simplify that as much as you can, as you don't want to have thousands of different categories or labels that are essentially retaining for the same amount of time or doing the exact same actions. And so how easy is it to create? Well, I can import it if I wanted to. If I already have a retention schedule, maybe I have it in Excel or in another legacy tool, I could just import it in a CSV template we have. But I can also create a label very easily. So in this case, I'll go ahead and create one for my European Union contracts. I'll give a description for users and admins around it. I'll go ahead and I can provide some file plan descriptors, which are really useful for me. This is metadata that goes on the retention label for you as the administrator of your retention schedule to be able to manage the file plan. And so I can group by different business function or by the provision or citation. So I can really leverage how to easily manage all of the retention schedule. And then the meat of a retention label is to define the retention settings, or how long will this information will be kept and how it should behave. So let's take a look at those options. First is whether I want to retain the content or not. And in this case, it's a contract. I want to make sure that I retain it. And then I can specify for how long. In this case, 7 years is fine. I could choose a different amount of years or even a custom period like a few days to forever. I then have the opportunity of saying, what should happen at the end of this period? I could choose to do nothing and leave the content in its place. I just make sure that for those 7 years, it didn't go anywhere. I could also choose to delete it automatically if I feel good about making sure that it's gone after that time. Or I could select to trigger a disposition review and assign somebody, in this case, for example, Adele, to be able to review the content and approve that it can be disposed before it's actually deleted. I can also select when this period, when do these 7 years will start. That can be based on when the content was created, when it was last modified, when it actually got its label applied to it, or even an event. And an event would be things like execution of a contract, an employee leaving the organization, for example, is a very common one. All of those kind of external events that would be able to be triggered, and when those events happen, then you can start the retention period. I'm going to keep it simple for now and just choose created, and then I can choose whether I want to classify this content as a record or not. I'm going to choose that I do want to classify it as a record, because once that contract is created, I don't want anybody to be able to edit it. I want to make sure that it is a record. That's a main difference between records and non-record labels, is that they will apply additional restrictions to the content. So I'll go ahead and click yes here and create the label. And that's all it took. It's that simple, and I already have my new label. So you could do that for each one of them, or as I mentioned, import them, and you can have all of your categories created. Now that's around defining those categories, but what about classifying the content? Usually that is one of the hardest parts that we find customers struggle with, on making sure how do their all data gets categorized. And so first thing is that we can classify content across Microsoft 365 and third-party data. If you're not familiar with it, I won't demo it today in the interest of time, but we do have our Microsoft 365 data connectors that let you bring in data from third-party systems to archive it into Microsoft 365 and be able to apply all of our compliance either discovery or retention policies on it. And then let's take a look at how we can look at automating that classification and making sure that everything is immutable while still keeping customers collaborating. So let me switch over to the demo again. We just created that EU contract, and if I select it, I see that I have a couple of options of what to do next. The first option, and maybe easiest for some of our customers, is that I could just publish this label. Publish the label means that it will be available in the end user experience, whether it's SharePoint or Outlook, if you're working on Exchange, email, to be able to be labeled manually. So a file could be labeled, an email could be labeled, and so publishing the label will make it available for end users to label. However, we know that that doesn't scale very well. You could put it one by one in each one of the items, or you could even choose to set it as a default on a folder or a document library in SharePoint, which is very helpful, but it's still confined to that particular area. And so it requires some user interaction. So we have also additional options for auto-applying the labels, and I want to focus on that for this demo right now. If I'm looking for that label, I confirm that's the label that I want to auto-apply. I have 3 different options on how to auto-apply it, beyond the option of just setting it as a default on a location, which is also another way of auto-applying. The 3 are, first, to apply the label to content that matches or contains certain sensitive information type. And so in here, we actually include about 100 different types of sensitive information, which are patterns that we would look for in the content. And you could select one of them or a group of them, in this case, like financial data, to be able to match to that and then apply the label. For example, if I'm looking for contracts, I could imagine maybe contracts typically have financial data. So I could be looking for credit card number or debit card numbers in it and then say that is a contract. Although that's a pretty narrow definition. So for contract, that doesn't really help me a lot, but there's many other applications where it could. And we even allow you to create your own custom pattern matching or regular expression to be able to use here. Now, the other option we have available is content that contains specific words, phrases, or properties. And here, we have one of the most powerful but underwhelming user experiences that we have, because this is really a really powerful keyword query editor. For those that are familiar with KQL or search in SharePoint or Microsoft 365, you could build some really complex queries here. And when items match that query, then we would automatically apply the label to it. If, for example, you've been using content types in SharePoint, and you could use something like this query for content type equals contract to be able to automatically apply the label that we just created. However, at Contoso, which is this demo that I'm doing, we have not been using content types, so can't use that option. So let's take a look at what's the third one. The third one is the option of applying the label to content that matches a trainable classifier. A trainable classifier are our newest way of classifying data, and it's shared across all of our information protection and governance pillars. So you can use it for protecting the data as well as retention related operations. But the concept is very simple. What we're looking for here is we have a machine learning model that will be able to detect when something is of a certain type of data. And so how do you create those? Well, we have some that we ship out of the box, and you'll see the publisher is Microsoft. For example, resume is a good example of that. A resume looks a certain way, has certain words. And so what we've done is we've trained our model for resumes on thousands of resumes from around the world, and then you can use it to be able to determine when there's a resume there. Now, for most organizations, it would be pretty hard for us at Microsoft to create the particular models that you're going to need. Maybe they're press releases, maybe there are environmental impact assessments. It depends on your organization. And so for that, you can actually create your own custom trainable classifier. I won't go through the whole process here just in the interest of time, but for example, at Contoso, we already have went in and created a Contoso contracts trainable classifier. How we've done that is essentially we've taken a minimum set of about 50 contracts and provided them to the system. It's created a draft model out of that. And then we've taken a set of at least 200 positive and negative samples. So contracts and documents that may look like contracts, but were not contracts, and provided those to the system as well. And then we actually provided feedback on whether the system could appropriately guess from each one of those whether it was a contract or not. And so we said, yes, you got this one right. No, you didn't. And so when you do that kind of training, you're able to create this classifier. And when you're ready, you just publish it and it shows up here. Now, how can I use that classifier? Let's take a look. Once I've selected the classifier, I'll just go ahead and give a quick name to my policy and then select where I'm going to use it. For now, I'm going to select just SharePoint and select that I want to auto apply. So let me switch over to a different experience, which is my information worker. I have a Word document, I just closed it out, which includes contract essentially, but it doesn't have the word contract anywhere. It doesn't really say that it's a contract, but all the wording on it, you can, any person would be able to tell it's a contract. So I'm going to select it from here. I on purpose named it proposal so that it would be not related to keywords. As I upload it, you can see it may take a while, but it will automatically get classified and we'll get that even that classification as a record from the label we had. If I select it, you can actually see the EU contracts. Let me lower here. You can see the EU contracts label applied to it. And I can see that it has actually been declared as a record. It even has on my record status column. And so that automatic classification, I've essentially said, go look at anywhere in SharePoint where somebody uploads something that looks like a contract and automatically classify with the label. Now, one of the things that we often had in traditional records management is that when something's declared as a record, that's it, it's immutable, you can't change it. And so that means if I have to make a different version of these proposals, or maybe there's some amendment to it, I would have to download it, probably create a copy of it, change the name of it, and then re-upload it, which is pretty complicated, and I lose all that rich version history. So we've included a new feature that's called our records versioning, which allows you to go to this record status and unlock a record. And when you're unlocking, we're not violating the immutability of it. We're creating an immutable copy behind the scenes, where we're letting now customers be able to edit it, make changes to it, make a different amendment, all without having to leave the version that they're already used to. And then just when they're ready, come back and lock it again and declare it as a record. This is especially helpful, and you can see if I go to the version history, all the versions are there and it tells me which ones were records. This is particularly helpful when you think about things like a training manual or a standard operating procedure that has been widely distributed, that everybody has the link for, and you don't want to publish a different version necessarily, but you want to make sure that each version that was published is its own record. And so, great way of doing that. And so that's around classification. Like I mentioned, many different ways to classify. You could use manual classification, setting the label as a default to be auto-applied, or are 3 different types of auto-classification across the suite. You could go broad from it, not just SharePoint, but Exchange, email, etc.
Roberto, I got one. I want to jump in on one question on that.
Yes, please.
The record label piece, or the record status pieces. That's definitely one on the newer side. If a so we talked about creating the retention label and creating the policies for that label and what they can do in the disposition of it. If you have for that label we just were talking about, if we had that a disposition process for that label, to say, let's just say it was a year, if a file has multiple versions or multiple records of those versions, would they actually have multiple dispositions then for each of those records for that version?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
So the let's say that first version of the contract that I unlocked, and we create that essentially that immutable copy behind the scenes to be preserved, that one will follow its own retention period, its own retention schedule, and will reach disposition on its own probably earlier than the next one that you have modified, because it might have been modified last or created a year before the other one, right? And so when you lock the item again, now the latest item will start its retention period and eventually reach disposition.
Absolutely, and that's why I think why it's such that's one that we've seen, or that I've seen especially, that's been hard for people. We'd have to create multiple versions of the files or move the file somewhere to be able to meet that type of control and say, okay, let's say employee handbooks are a really good one, right? Where you have to keep something and you 100%, and you have a link to that file somewhere where everyone can access the employee handbook. But let's say they change the PTO. Let's say we're going to 10 days to 15, right? At some point, you're going to want to have an approval that this did change, and we want to get rid of the old version so someone finds it. They know that it's an old version of it. That disposition would kick in for that record, but that new file would still be there. Right? Whatever, like the file would not go because you actually have another immutable record of it using the new version of it, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, please jump in with any other questions. I'll talk through a little bit of this, and then we'll jump into all the other questions. And so the last piece that I wanted to just talk through really quick is the execution part, which you just started to talk about. That disposition, collecting those disposition approvals, making sure that you've signed off on records being destroyed, and then how do I have that proof of disposition or the destruction of records, and where's my defensibility? How do I know where everything's at? And so let's go through this really quick, just to give you a little bit of an idea. When I'll switch over to this experience where when you have a disposition review that's been triggered, I'll get an email like this that says, hey, your content has reached its disposition, or it's about to, and so I can use the click the link that it's right on the email, and then get to the disposition experience in the compliance center. From here, I can come in and, for example, go to my EU contract label, and you will notice two things before I go there. One, we have here all of those labels that were pending disposition, which means they are disposition review labels. But I also have some labels that you will start to see now on your tenants that are just record labels set to automatically delete the content. This is a new feature that we've rolled out, where even if your content is set to be declared as a record and then automatically deleted, we will be preserving the record of that, or the metadata around that record being automatically deleted for several years. And so you will start to see in this disposition experience those labels that are just set to automatic deletion. Now, our EU contract one was actually set up to be a disposition review label. So let's take a look at how I can approve that. In this case, I go in and I see all the items that are pending disposition, and I can select one of them. I can click on it to go to the location if I need to review it in more detail, and I can choose what to do here. I could choose to approve the disposal. I could choose to extend it if I want to defer this for a while, or even change the label. In this case, I'm going to choose to approve the disposal. And as soon as I've done that and the content has been deleted, I'll actually find it under the disposed items, and I'll find all the information around it. Now, because this was a record, we'll actually keep this information for up to 7 years in here. And so that way you can know where everything has been at. We also have our audit experience, which all of these events and editing of categories and all of that is audited. So you can always keep using that. And if you have not checked it out, the other piece I wanted to show you is our data classification horizontal. This location is, this is part of the compliance center, this section. And it has a couple of really powerful items we've evolved since being in the Security and Compliance Center. One being the Content Explorer, where you can come in and, for example, for that EU contract label, I can see where items have been declared with that label all across my Microsoft 365 in Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive. So I could go into SharePoint and even look at one of the items like in terms of finance and actually see the items and even be able to get, if I have the right permissions, a preview of all of those items. So as a records manager, this is really powerful because I can look at what's been going on or where is the content without having to leave the compliance center. And I can do the same with the Activity Explorer, where I can select a retention label as well as other filtering criteria and be able to see all of the activities that have been happening on files that have that label. So I can see if files are getting deleted, if they're getting the label applied or removed. All of those things I can see without having to leave the compliance center. And so with that, that's a kind of a whirlwind, super quick, high-level overview of where we are with records management and what you can do. I would invite you, we have some resources at the end that we will share, to go look at some of the other webinars we've done more in-depth around records management. And of course, we have upcoming Ignite in about a month, which we will be sharing a lot more in-depth details, and we'll be sharing a lot around announcements. If there are any questions, Drew, otherwise I'd be happy to jump into sharing a little bit of kind of what might be coming in the future.
Yeah, so a couple, definitely both of us for myself, and I know that I've came through actually prior. One, licensing for records management. Is there a separate, so the solution we're looking at now, is that inclusive in E3, or is this a separate add-on for E3?
Great question. Licensing, as always, I'll say my caveat of always talk to your license, to your Microsoft account representative. That's the best way to get question answered. General terms, records management is part of our E5 set of features. And so all of our records management solution in the Compliance Center, it's an E5 solution. And you can go through our service descriptions if you want to understand a little better what does that mean for your organization. But there are many ways to license it. If you're Microsoft 365 E5 or Office 365 E5 subscriber, or there's an E5 compliance add-on you can buy if you're E3, or even an information protection and governance add-on if you want to go that route. And so there's many ways for customers to be able to leverage this.
Yeah, and I'll add to that one. So there's some new SKUs that came out this year that can that I'm seeing a lot of customers take advantage of, especially in the compliance space, for this to meet these types of needs, and you can get creative there. So definitely look at what you can do and talk to your licensing rep for it. So
Absolutely.
Diving a little bit in when clicking on that record, the checkbox for record. So when you're on when you're creating the label and you click that record checkbox, we said restrictions are added. Can you speak a little bit to what restrictions are added, and like the power of that label,
Yeah.
of that checkbox there, or that click?
Totally, and that's a great plug for our documentation, because we have been working really hard on updating our public documentation. So if you go to docs.microsoft.com and you go to compliance documentation, the Microsoft 365 compliance documentation, you'll see that we have a whole section around information governance and records management. Our content team has been doing a fantastic job to make sure that we clean up and provide a lot of that guidance. The reason why I mentioned that is because we actually do have, and we can probably paste it on the link for everybody on the chat here. We do have an article that breaks that down. And so we have a very useful table that would tell you how does a retention label that is not a record behave versus a retention label that is a record behave? And so we talk about each one of the restrictions. At a high level, declaring it as a record will make sure that that version that you're declaring, the actual content cannot be changed. And so we apply additional restrictions to the site, to the file itself, when something is declared a record. In the example of, for example, an email that you declare as a record, you won't actually be able to delete it. It will remain there. Same as for a file that's been declared as a record in SharePoint. And so we have some of those restrictions that's where that record status of unlock and relock comes in. We also have some restrictions on if you can move it out of the site or out of the location that it is on that start to play. Especially if you've ever unlocked a record, we don't let that record ever leave that site because it has a relationship to that site. And so there's some of those clarifications that we outline very well in the documentation.
Yeah, and that for everyone, that is a really good, the documentation is great around that. It definitely can highlight what those differences are, especially if someone bring another question specific to records label as well. So if, and this is how it exists today, is that if you created a record label, a retention label, and then made it a record-based label, you can't delete that label.
Correct.
So
correct.
The question was, is there any plans to change that, or what is kind of the reasoning behind that locking of that record label once it's been created?
There are some plans. And so we've heard from customers that many times you might create a record label as a test, and you have valid business reasons to delete it because you don't want to keep it around. The reason why we don't let a record label be deleted is because there's a lot of those records that are being preserved, the metadata, the proof of disposals that are related to it. And so we do have plans to allow the deletion of a record label in the case that there's nothing in this tenant that is labeled with it. And essentially, it will be a kind of a big warning for customers to take on the responsibility of knowing that they are deleting something that could essentially break the chain of defensibility of understanding what was that label at the time and things like that. And so as long as customers are okay with that, there are some cases in which we will eventually allow that deletion.
Okay. For email, so you kind of touched on it for a second, email-based retention rate. The demo we kind of looked at was very file specific, but
yeah,
do you want to, two things on that. Do you want to speak, can you speak a little bit to if there are any differences in what we talked about today for retention and records management as it relates to email? And then the one I know comes up is the exchange-based legacy retention model that's available in Exchange Online. Very common one is, let's say people are doing a 30-day deletion in their sent items, let's say.
Yeah.
What are you seeing, or what is kind of Microsoft's plan for adapting to that using Modernize records management? So kind of a two-part question there: overall Exchange, and then specific to the some of the Exchange retention capabilities today.
Totally. So overall Exchange, one of the things that we've been focusing over the last year especially is to make sure that there's a lot more parity between Exchange, SharePoint, and the behaviors are very similar. So all of the capabilities we talked about, being able to apply a label, being able to automatically classify content, all of that applies to Exchange emails as well. So you can leverage it today. In Exchange, you can apply a retention label into email, and you will see a new information bar that will tell you that that is there. In terms of records management, you can apply declare content as records. You can declare them on shared locations, like a shared mailbox, if you want to not keep it on a non-custodial or kind of a user location. And you are also able to, they can coexist with your traditional retention policies that you would have say your kind of what we call MRM policies, right? The old exchange online policy. So if you have something like a 30-day delete or things like that, if you were to apply a label or automatically classify something, let's say we had this contract classifier and we found that you had an email that contained a contract, then we automatically applied that label of, hey, this is actually an EU contract. That will actually follow our retention principle. So because it is a longer retention than the one that you had by default on all your content, it will be retained for longer. And so all of these features, you're also able to leverage for your email as well. I know that some customers prefer to move their email into shared locations like SharePoint, etc. But we really feel that the in-place location of your mailbox is the best place for email, so that you can get all the richness of the message editing, or being able to see the messages, visual viewing, actually, not editing.
Awesome. So I want to dive a little bit into trainable classifiers and some of the kind of the regex pattern matching that exists today. So what would be some more of the use cases that you see that you believe the trainable classifiers would be used for, in a sense of retention and records? And do you see that as kind of being a primary use of trainable classifiers?
We actually are. The feedback we're getting from some of the customers that are getting started with trainable classifiers since we announced them last Ignite is that retention is definitely one of those hero scenarios for detecting this type of content. So some of the examples are, like I mentioned during the demo, every organization has these type of documents that are unique to them. And typically those documents either, follow particular language, or they follow certain types of things like that. I would say this first iteration of trainable classifiers we've seen be really good at detecting when particular language is used on a certain set of documents that is different from the language you use normally on all of your other documents. So contract is a good example because I think we're all familiar with it. The kind of legal terms and how you talk within a contract is very different than how you create a regular document, to share some technical specification or anything like that you would create within your organization. So that we've seen trainable classifiers be very effective at detecting. We are constantly evolving that and improving it to be able to detect things like format of the documents and some other things. Numbers heavy might not be as effective, if you're just looking at, it's a lot of numbers, but not a lot of words. It's a little harder because there's not a lot for us to, discern or basically be able to understand from the document. So what we're doing with trainable classifiers is really understanding the document and then understanding whether that looks like the category that you've created or it looks very different than that. And so that, I would say that's kind of the key scenarios.
And I think a good way to put it is it's different than regex, right? You're not just doing a regular call on the document to say, let me find a pattern of 3 characters and a probability of the letters SSN somewhere in it, like within the next 16 characters of it, let's say, right?
Correct.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So that's the big advantage. So one of the questions is around false positives, and if you're looking at how you could potentially use that, if you have ideas of even where you're getting false positives, you could look at maybe just because the format of the language coming through, it could definitely help that scenario. I had a customer where we were working with this, and it was before trainable classifiers were out, and it was Canadian, and a Canadian company, and we wanted to use we wanted to just track and report on HIPAA information from a healthcare side. And one of the things that ended up getting caught was the Canadian passport number was identical format to their account number, or like the personal account ID. So we instantly got flagged with a massive amount of technically false positives, but it's mainly because what we kind of missed on it was the types of documents that would really matter, right? It was the healthcare documents with the personal information. That was important for the account information, but a random document in someone's OneDrive that had an ID that somehow got flagged as a passport number, it didn't match. So I think you're right, from a hero story, there can be good examples, but it could be unique by industry, it could be unique by your environment. The ability to have an ML capability around it instead of just regex does open up future capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. I got one more for you. So you mentioned bringing in third-party system information or bringing in other data. Could you speak a little bit more onto what types of whether it's a type of system or what you kind of really meant when you said bringing that data into Microsoft 365?
Absolutely. So in the Compliance Center, we have our data connectors section that you can go in and you can import third-party data into 365 and then leverage all of our compliance solutions there. Really, it really lights up the compliance scenario there. And so today we have a handful of connectors out there, and within the very near future, we were going to be expanding that exponentially. So over the next few months, you'll see that number become several dozens of connectors from different systems, from messaging. Even we have customers wanting to bring text message information, chat information from other systems. All of that, you will be able to bring in that third-party data. And as you've inputted, now you can discover it, you can apply appropriate retention to it, you could, auto-classify it, like you can auto-classify the rest of it, etc.
Awesome. That was really good. There were some that were answered in the chat too. Thank you, Tina. But
Awesome.
Overall, we're at the top of the hour. So, Roberto, anything else you want to add? You want to talk a little bit about? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, great. Just a last mention for those that are stuck around a couple of minutes after the hour. Just wanted to kind of highlight a couple of things. One, we have a couple of webinars that you can go check out. Our documentation I mentioned. If you don't have E5 today, you can start a trial of E5 compliance and take all of this out for a spin. But especially, we want your feedback through user voice. And so we do have in the compliance user voice, we have a section or a category for information governance and records management. And we do look at it. We're constantly looking at the top reported issues, new issues, or new feedback that customers are giving us. So we want to hear your feedback. We want to understand your feedback on these features and what we can do to make the product better.
Awesome. Well, thank you very, very much, Roberto. I'm really excited to see Ignite. You mentioned it a bit. Ignite is coming up in September. It's only in less than a month, actually, and I'm sure that you have a few meetings daily, both you and Tina, on the stuff for Ignite. So for everybody, I think registration is not open yet. I think it's going to open in a few weeks now, but I'm not sure if you can talk. Are you going to be presenting or not?
Yeah, there will be several sessions that we'll cover. We're trying a little bit of a different format. Hopefully everybody likes it, but there will be a ton of content, and it's gonna be a different approach to Ignite. So it'll feel a little different, but hopefully it'll have everything you want to be able to learn. We'll have a lot of announcements, so watch out for our sessions that we will have during Ignite. All the content that we're going to be posting at that time, as well as we'll always post a blog that will have all of our announcements. So if you're not already following the Microsoft 365 compliance blog in the tech community, please do that. That's a great way to hear all of our announcements as we release things.
Awesome. And remember, everyone, Ignite is free this year, so you have no excuse not to register this year. It's absolutely free. Watch from home. You have to bring your own popcorn and drinks this time, but register, watch as much as you can, and you'll be able to access everything else on demand. Well, we're 6 minutes past the time. Thank you very much, Roberto, for taking time out of your day, and Tina as well. Thank you both so much. Let me restart my camera here as well. Thank you both so much for taking time for the community. I'm sure all of us are looking forward to see all of the cool stuff you both will be talking about at Ignite in less than a month. Have a great day, everyone, and
Thank you.
stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.